Hey there folks, welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And today I'm going to be talking about the debut album from Tinashe, titled Aquarius. So if any of you remember any of my reviews from 2013, particularly when I talked about R&B at all, I may have mentioned that I didn't tend to be a huge fan of the genre, mostly tied to underwritten lyrics, songwriting topics that haven't really evolved all that much, and particularly in modern years, a brand of very synthetic, bleak production that was really a lot bleaker than any of the subject matter could effectively support or back up. Well, this year seems to be doing its best to crush my predilections towards the genre into rubble, because not only is R&B bigger than ever this year, there have been some genuinely great records in this vein that have come out. I've only warmed all the more to LP1 by FKA Twigs since I reviewed it earlier this year, and Jhené Aiko's Sold Out is still one of my favorite albums of this year, mostly for proving all of my preconceptions surrounding R&B nearly completely wrong in terms of songwriting, themes, and instrumentation. And considering that R&B, particularly female-fronted R&B, and especially the stuff drawing a lot of inspiration from the indie scene, has only gotten huge this year, I figured that, you know what, keeping my eye on some of the artists who do actually land some degree of chart success could prove to be very interesting going forward. And sure enough, I started getting requests to cover Tinashe, a California-based R&B singer who I most recognize from, and I can't believe I'm actually going to mention this on camera, 2.5 Men, where she played Jake's girlfriend Celeste. Originally a member of the girl group The Stunners, she began making mixtapes from her home studio, which eventually caught the serious attention of RCA Records, who signed her and overloaded her with some of the biggest producers in mainstream R&B and hip-hop right now. And with the album full of interludes and guest appearances, this looked to be a debut with a fair amount of ambition behind it, and some degree of critical acclaim. So I gave it a couple of listens. What'd I find? Honestly, not a lot. I don't know what I was expecting from her big hit single 2 On, but if Sold Out by Jhené Aiko is the sort of R&B I like, intelligent, layered, melodic, emotionally driven, Aquarius by Tinashe is not. I'm not gonna say this album is bad, because really on a certain level it kinda works, but it reminds me a lot of YG's My Crazy Life, that debut album from earlier this year. And that's got a very simple focus, and there's ambition here to say more, and for some people I can definitely see this album really resonating. I get why people like it, but it's also limited on all sides by production, lyrics, and even Tinashe as a performer. And yet at the same time, I can see this record having some of the broadest overall appeal of the R&B albums that I have reviewed thus far this year, because it's definitely the most modern and most flagrantly commercial. So on that note, let's start with the instrumentation and production, and really, I'm not all that impressed. Tinashe managed to pull together your typical mainstream pop R&B producers. Boy Wonder, Mike Will Made It, Detail, DJ Mustard, and even Stargate. And surprise, surprise, it sounds exactly what you'd expect from them taking a crack at the current trends in indie R&B. The bass is heavy and leaden, the percussion and beats are shoved right to the front of the mix over any sort of real melody, and when the music does not feel swallowed up in reverb, it sounds like it's underwater, complete with pitch shifting on backing vocals, which I have never ever liked. And sure, the percussion often sounds brittle and has some real texture, and there are points where some of the keyboards do pick up fragments of a melodic hook, but it sure as hell doesn't stick with me in my memory because the piano line is often so thin and high that's got no memorable presence beyond just adding to a very pretty atmosphere that's undercut by every single harsher element or the interjection of gang vocals. The balance that they're trying here just doesn't work for me. And that's not saying that there aren't moments on this album that I do like, because there are. The guitar solo that comes out of nowhere on Bet was definitely appreciated. I kind of like the dreamy Janet Jackson inspired flourishes on How Many Times. The clattering percussion was a little bit too loud on Pretend, but the song had a good vibe, at least for me. And the muted pianos on the back end of Bated Breath were pretty, albeit played a little bit clumsily. Hell, the interludes, Indigo Child, Deep in the Night, and The Storm were pretty damn solid for creating some overall atmosphere. But overall, the mixes, they feel cluttered, shallow, and way too percussion heavy to back themselves up. If you've got a song called Wildfire that does not evoke a single image of flames at all, you're doing it wrong, I'm sorry. And that's not counting the out-of-place pan flute breakdown on All Hands on Deck, which does not fit at all with the DJ Mustard-inspired melody or cheap chorus synth line, or how Mike Will made its production on Thug Cry is so hollow and washed out, and yet so shallow it just sounds astoundingly cheap and overall pretty weak, all things considered. Now granted, Tinashe doesn't really help matters. And here's the thing. I remember reading a fair few reviews that were pretty critical of Jhené Aiko's choice to use a little bit less of her pretty extensive vocal range on Sold Out. But given that the intentional feeling of malaise that she was creating on that first half of that album, plus with all the references back to Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind, it really completely fit. Tinashe does not really have that excuse, and outside of the pretty dense multi-track vocal leads across this album, she doesn't really modulate or show a lot of range beyond this breathless coo supported by pitch correction and a more strident voice that never really rises above average. I'm not saying she's a bad singer, but we're definitely not seeing much of her full range, and I don't get a huge amount of emotional investment in her delivery all that either. Most of this is because she spends most of the album delivering her lyrics in a very faded affectation that does not really grab a lot of attention from me, and certainly does not fit when you place her on a track with Schoolboy Q delivering a characteristically raunchy verse on 2 On, or when Future is spraying his jittery half auto-tune nonsense all over how many times and just sounds plain out awful. Now this takes us to lyrics. And remember how I said at the beginning how I thought with all the interludes in this album it might have a fair sense of ambition or maybe even a story to tell? Yeah, that does not really happen here because the interludes really only add atmosphere rather than contribute to a non-existent narrative. And normally, that's fine. But I'm having a hard time with this album presenting any sort of consistency lyrically. There are songs like Bet and Cold Sweat where she's trying to go for the finally made it vibe analogous to a lot of hip-hop artists, or on songs like All Hands on Deck, Far Side of the Moon, and Wildfire, where she tries to drive home that she's dumping some guy who's worthless. But I'm sorry, while Tinashe has the dismissiveness down on these songs, I don't exactly find them convincing, especially since Far Side of the Moon has Not Over It written all over the track. And you know what, to be fair to her, she does comment on that insecurity and uncertainty in the song, but I'm still arguing it doesn't really stick the landing all that well. And that's not even getting into her more sex-related songs, because on the one hand, you got songs like How Many Times and Feels Like Vegas, which built some pretty decent vibes, but between Future's awful verse and how easily she drops into a very submissive role, which does not fit all that well with her more dominant presence when she's trying to dump guys, and yet she's so good in bed that she can make a thug cry. I'm sorry, it does not really fit together there, especially when you follow it with Bated Breath, a song that's very much in the school of Let's Wait a While by Janet Jackson, and is honestly significantly more convincing when Tinashe sings it. But overall, I'm sorry, it presents kind of a mixed message here. And this comes back to my primary issue with Tinashe. And then we get a lot of unique facets of an artistic persona, but not a lot to really define that persona. She's the party girl, the alpha female whose sex is on fire unless she's asking for the guy to wait or calling him daddy. And that's not even touching on the pseudo-spiritual flourishes that pepper the lyrics on the interludes or on the title track, most of which feel jacked from the song of the same name from the musical Hair almost 50 years ago. My point is here is that there's a lot of breadth, but not a lot of depth. And that really frustrates me because I know Tinashe is capable of it. I've listened to her mixtapes. There was a lot of real potential there. And hell, there are moments lyrically on this album that do show a fair bit of nuance. I already mentioned the self-awareness on Far Side of the Moon and on Bated Breath, which I did like, but there's also Pretend, the relationship song with A$AP Rock, where he actually delivers a pretty good verse that shows her looking for the illusion of happiness that she knows won't really last. And that can mean that parts of this album really do feel kind of shallow to me, which would be fine on tracks like 2 On or All Hands on Deck or even Feels Like Vegas, which don't need depth to have any real impact. But I'm sorry, the execution here with the instrumentation does not really impress me as all that unique. So in the end, I'm sorry here, I was really underwhelmed by this album. Tinashe's Aquarius is not bad, but I have a hard time calling it all that good or all that interesting, especially in a year where we had women in R&B, specifically new albums from Mariah Carey, SZA, Ariana Grande, Banks, and especially Jhené Aiko and FKA Twigs. That said, there are moments I did like and appreciate, which is enough to save this album up to a solid 5 out of 10, but at most, Aquarius just did nothing for me. If you've heard the many other R&B albums drops this far this year, give this a listen, I guess, but don't be surprised if you leave pretty unsatisfied. At least I did. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. Before you sling all that hate in the comments, well, leave your opinion there. I'd be happy to hear what you thought about this album, but honestly for me, didn't do a lot. Going beyond that, if there's any other albums that you want me to take a look at, or is there anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, I'm all ears. Until then, I'm Mark, you're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.